Howdy y'all, and welcome back to Country Fried Minis. I'm your host Cameron, the country boy in the big city, finally presenting to you once again from the Bullshit Corner 2.0. And today I'd like to talk to y'all about cutting corners. Now, regular viewers of the channel might notice that I've kind of fallen off the face of the planet for a few months, and I'd like to start out this video by apologizing for that. This last semester has been kind of rough on me, and it's been a little overwhelming, so I haven't had time to really invest in my hobby and put any fun country-fied videos content out for y'all. But that's here to change because the repairs to my apartment are finally complete, and I'm back here in my corner, and I'm ready to get rolling once again. With all my classes having major projects come due and finals coming through here at the end of the semester, I didn't really have a lot of time to prepare for this month's Battletech meetup. In order to combat that, I went ahead and printed out a small lance on my Anycubic Photon and got it ready. However, once I was done with all my classwork and printing out the mechs, I realized I only had about a day left to get these models painted up. So that's what we're going to focus on today. How I went through and cut some corners to get these mechs done in a single sitting. And if you follow these tips, you can do the same too. Right now I'm showing y'all two fabulous tools that are available for you to search mech colors on the internet. And that's going to be Unit Color Compendium and Camo Specs Online. With these two websites, you can kind of see what mechs are going to look like in the color scheme in both the MechWarrior Online art styling as well as on painted models. I already knew that I wanted to build a Carita Lance, but I need it to be black so that I can get away with just using the primer as the base coat. So the best choice here is obviously going to be the Otomo. They're just flat black with a fabulous gold bit of highlights over top. And now that I've got the colors chosen, I'm going to go ahead and boot up MegaMech and start putting together my lance. I'm going to go ahead and start out here with the Akuma because I already know that I want this mech as the champion of this here lance. From here, all I really knew is I wanted a lance with a ton of missiles, and what better to do that than mechs with an Artemis 4 control system. To find them, I'm going to go ahead and pop open this here advanced search feature and search for chassis that have this system. And by using this tool, I found three fabulous chassis with which to play with. I've got the Avatar AV1-OB with its LRM-15s and LRM-10s, the Longbow LGB-12C with its LRM-20s and its LRM-15s, as well as a Strider SR1-O, which has two SRM-6s with the Artemis 4 control systems. I've also gone ahead and tweaked the piloting and gunnery numbers on these mechs and added some infantry and vehicles to make a nice well-rounded combined arms lance. At this point, everything looked absolutely perfect except for the Longbow. I searched and searched and searched and could not find anywhere an STL file that accurately represented the LGB-12C Longbow. Owing to a bit of amateur experience in Blender, I went ahead and loaded the standard Longbow variant into the program. From here, I simply used some cubes and some Boolean functions to go ahead and copy the missile launchers from the arms and make small versions to shrink down and put into the shoulder sockets. This took some serious trial and error and a whole lot of fiddling around, but eventually I was able to put together a workable tabletop representation of the 12C variant. From here, I just added some supports in Prusa Slicer and sent it on over to my Anycubic Photon to be printed right out. This print turned out to look just fine on the tabletop and even has a very pleasing, imposing silhouette. I was a bit concerned about how some of these chassis would look once printed out, but to be honest, they all look just fine and dandy, and I'm quite pleased with the results. Personally, I tend to avoid the 3D printed models in my lances. I prefer the old plastics or the old Ironwind metal sculpts, and I use them where I can. I do enjoy supporting the original sculptors as well as my friendly local gaming store, but every now and then I think that a 3D printed lance or an addition to a lance could look just fabulous in a Battletech set. There's just far too many options available now that you can't get in traditional miniature format. Although it was super pleasing to print out the entirety of this lance, including the bases, it does have the downside that all 3D printed models do, and that's the ton of cleaning that comes after printing. In my experience, 3D prints always leave a bunch of little marks from where the supports were attached and are always going to need some amount of filing and sanding. I just so happen to have the file set produced by Army Painter, and I set to work cleaning them all up. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention one more problem that can occur with multi-part 3D printed models. Often is the case that the 3D printer's anti-aliasing will make portions that have tightly fitting parts a little too big. That's especially evident here with the torso fitting on the Akuma. The peg and the hole are just fractions of a micron too big and don't really fit anymore, so they need to be really reamed out with the file. Nevertheless, it ain't no trouble at all to get this done. All it takes is a little bit of gumption and a bit of time, and before you know it, your parts will be nice and tidied up. One word of caution regarding cleaning up these resin bits. All this filing is going to produce a ton of dust that you don't need to be breathing in, so make sure you wear a mask or a respirator while you're working on your models. And I really mean it. Wear you a mask or a respirator while you're working on this. Long-term exposure to this fine particulate dust can cause severe respiratory irritation and even some long-term allergy development. Now, with that health warning out of the way, we're going to go ahead and start cleaning up these here models. I'm going to start by getting out a dedicated toothbrush just for this purpose and a little disposable shot glass, both of which are inexpensive products that I can pick up at my local dollar store. And with the receptacle and the tool prepared up, I'm going to go ahead and pour out some 70% isopropyl rubbing alcohol into this cup. You don't need much, you're just going to be dipping the toothbrush into it and maybe doing a little light cleaning with it later, so just a tiny bit will do you. And with that, we're going to dip and we're going to scrub and we're going to rinse and repeat and get all these little bits and bobs all cleaned up and ready for painting later. It's also a good policy to go ahead and clean up your files while you have this alcohol out and get them just as clean as the models. Because once we're done here, we're going to take the little bit of alcohol that's left and pour it on a paper towel and use it to wipe up the painting surface before we move on to the next task. A little bit of clean as you go goes a real long way. Now that I got the models all cleaned up, I'm going to go ahead and toss them back under my UV nail curing station just to really ensure that they're nice and hard cured before we move on to assembly and then painting. Although these models have already been through a curing cycle before, I really want to make sure there's absolutely no resin left over on the surface and to cure them up nice and stiff underneath this here tool. This is another one of those implements that I highly recommend having in your arsenal if you're any kind of 3D printing enthusiast. Now that they've been through their second round of UV exposure, these models are ready to be put together so they can begin their transformation into finished game pieces. Just like most every other game piece, these models can be put together with just a bit of super glue and a little bit of accelerator to facilitate the process. It's good to remember that these here printed models are made of resin and are not plastic. So in that case, plastic glue and plastic cement will not work at all to put these models together. For that matter, you also can't put them together with acetone welding. Although this method works really well with PLA and ABS plastic filament 3D prints, it absolutely will not work with resin 3D prints. Instead, it's best to just stick to good old cyanoacrylate superglue and a little bit of accelerator if you're working with fiddly bits. This stuff can be applied dropwise if you need precision application, or sprayed on if you just want to make sure that every inch of the model is covered. Applying this stuff dropwise with precision is a great way to conserve your bottle for long-term usage. Since we're working with such small models, it's real easy to cure up these tiny spots of glue by using drops off the end of the inlet for the pump. This method will ensure that your bottle of accelerator will last far longer than if you just go spraying it all willy-nilly. That being said, I do like to use the spray method when I'm applying my mechs to the bases. First, I'm going to take a little bit of time and set the model on the base and ensure that I have a nice facing applied to it before I commit to any glue. Once I've got that worked out, I'm going to make note of where it touches the ground and apply glue to those sections on the mech's feet. From there, I'll go ahead and press it down on the base and give it a good old spritz of the accelerator. I find that this is the superior method because it saturates the base evenly and ensures all glue touching that base is going to cure up nicely, even if it's not touching it super solidly. You just set her up, give it a spritz, and she's done. Now that these 3D prints are all cleaned up and assembled, we'll go ahead and turn these raw models into colorful contenders for the tabletop. Let's dig out our supplies and get to work. It's time to paint, y'all. In starting the paint job on these models, it ain't no different from any other piece. I'm going to go ahead and start with a little bit of Stynylrez black primer shot through my brand new airbrush. I'm real pleased to go ahead and try out this here Badger 105 Aero airbrush, which I got on sale very recently. So far I'm finding that the performance is a little bit better than the good old Master discount brand that I've been using, but honestly those cheaper airbrushes will work just fine when applying a coat like a primer. You really start to see some improvement in the higher end airbrushes when you're talking about fine control, which is something that isn't really applicable for priming models. Regarding the task at hand, I always find that the Stynylrez primer is a little thick for my taste. So not only have I added a little bit of water to thin it out, just a touch, I've set my compressor fairly high to a setting around 30 psi. With this setting, I find that the Stynylrez primer flows fairly smoothly, but you can definitely run the risk of flooding your models with way too much primer. To combat this and prevent loss of detail, I'll go ahead and apply this paint in very light bursts from all angles, making sure to take time to rotate the models around and hit them from various directions. It also helps to work on several models at a time, so by the time you're done applying a bit of primer to each one, the first model is ready for a second coat. With a freshly cleaned airbrush, it's time to work on the next color. You can kind of see in this clip that I've taken some Vallejo paint, in this case dark sand, and thinned it to a rather runny consistency, something like skim milk. I want this color applied very light, as it's going to serve for layered color buildup on the bases. This application here is where quality airbrushes are really going to shine. The fine control is going to let me work with low pressure. In fact, I've got the compressor turned down to something like 15 psi. Furthermore, I'll be working very close to the surface of the model to tightly control the area of application. For the most part, I'm going to try to put this color all around the models and avoid as much overspray as possible. That said, it's okay if some of the color tints the lower extremities of the models. They are in the desert after all, and a bit of dust is expected. From here, it's time to clean out the airbrush once again and switch colors. In this case, the color of choice is Vallejo's Flat Earth. This just happens to be one of my most favorite colors, and I'm going to go ahead and apply this in a super thin coat to serve as a bit of color modulation for the sand. This tone will add a bit of subtlety that will read as a bit of warmth in the final product. The effect looks strong now, but it will end up mostly hidden under the next layer. The technique shown here is a really swift and convenient way to add a bit of tonal variety to your colors, all made possible by translucent layering with the airbrush. Finally, after yet another cleaning, it's time to put the top layer of dark sand onto these bases. By applying this tone lightly but thoroughly, we'll see a hint of the underlying colors through this top coat. The flat earth layer underneath adds a bit of warmth to the upper layer, and the underlying dark sand base is made fairly cool by the black primer. These variations in color temperature add a bit of dimensionality to what is otherwise a flat surface, again made possible by the use of an airbrush. Though this effect is absolutely achievable with brushwork, the time saved by using the sprayed-on paint is certainly invaluable to completing a project so swiftly. Once again, I highly recommend picking up an airbrush if you ain't got one already. With the airbrushing out of the way, it's time to get to the brushwork. Although the airbrush allows for saving quite a bit of time, this next step is my first real tip for cutting corners, and that's dry brushing. This particular paint job is going to use the black primer as the base coat, which will save me a good amount of time by reducing the amount of layers needed to color each model. I'm just mixing a touch of this here Citadel Mechanica Standard Gray into the Stynylrez black primer and applying it to the raised edges of these models with a real soft makeup brush. A good set of makeup brushes is another one of those tools that you don't really expect to use in miniature painting, but it's highly recommended and will really enhance your dry brushing effectiveness. This color application is intentionally kept real light so as to not lose the perception of the model being black. If we go too heavy, the models risk turning gray. That said, I'll go ahead and add a bit more gray for a second, lighter layer of dry brush highlighting. This layer is applied with a much gentler touch and is focused on the cockpit and center torso regions of the mechs. For the final highlight, I'm even going to go so far as to add a touch of white and apply this to the ghastly face of the Akuma. Since this mech is the Lance lead, it makes sense to draw a little extra attention to the focal point of the model. Next up, we're going to go ahead and do some accent work with this here Folk Art Sterling Silver metallic paint. It's not the best silver color out there, but it's inexpensive and it'll be shaded later using a couple washes. It'll look fine in the final result, absolutely good enough to achieve a passable tabletop standard in the completed models. This passability rings especially true in that this color is to be applied fairly sparingly. It could easily compete with the true second color, the gold, so needs to be applied only where absolutely necessary. I'll reserve this color for lasers and ballistic weapon barrels, heat exchange vents, and exposed joint actuation mechanical bits. Hopefully, with a bit of choice application and discretion, this color will serve to reinforce the mechanical nature of these gigantic war machines without contrasting too heavily with the Otomo signature gold accents. And speaking of gold, it's time to go ahead and start putting on these accents with Citadel's Auric Armor Gold. Honestly, I really loathe working with Citadel's metallic colors, and this particular pot of paint added to my preconceived sense of disappointment by needing a fair amount of stirring to get the paint back into suspension. That said, this color is super bright and vibrant without straying too far into the yellow realm, so will serve as a fantastic counterpoint to the black base color. The contrast should be just right against the blackish backdrop. This accent color will be used to outline choice panels, as well as to add some decorative stripes and designs, as well as to add some crude Gaijin painted kanji onto these honorable defenders of House Kurita. The loose Google Fu translations include some choice kanji symbols such as arrow and storm, as well as swift and even death. They are by no means accurate or even really legible at times, but will serve for strong thematic enhancements for these proud warriors of the Draconis Combine Shogunate. This process was a bit tedious and oftentimes required multiple passes of the metallic paint to get the saturation that I needed on the accents. Even then, it was a bit thin at times, but I chose to work with it and just favored getting this step done. And that leads me into my next tip for getting these paint jobs done expeditiously: accepting minor mistakes. Sure, a bit of a flub of the placement of a highlight can take away from the intended effect, but most of the time it's not the end of the world or even a ruination of the paint job. Rather than killing yourself taking forever on individual details, consider just focusing on getting these models done. Take yourself a moment and think back to the last time you were at a gaming session at your friendly local gaming store. How many of your fellow gamers took extra time to scrutinize your paint jobs? By and large, most people will view your models from an arm's length distance, so ensuring that every brush stroke is applied perfectly isn't necessarily a priority. Instead, consider getting some skirmish sets completed. Plus, you'll improve your techniques with every completed model. After all, that pile of shame ain't gonna paint itself. Not every piece that leaves your workstation needs to be the best you've ever done, and a whole lot of decently painted models sure beats the heck out of a handful of exquisite pieces in a sea of gray plastic. Just have fun with it and slap some colors onto your brand of brawlers. Experience is the best teacher, and grinding out a dozen or so mediocre line troops or medium mech chassis will go a long way in refining your brush control. I couldn't very well paint up some Kurita mechs without that classic red on it, so next up we're going to bust out this here Citadel Mephiston red and color up the only details that I thought were worthy: the tips of the missiles and the medium laser lenses. This step was indeed a bit tedious, and time consuming, but absolutely necessary, and leads me into my third tip of the day. If you got a tiny detail, use a tiny brush. Make sure you keep a brush with a nice sharp point to work on these tiny details when they show up in your projects. Keeping a dedicated brush sharp and ready to go for these tiny details will really help you avoid spillover by using a brush that's too big for this application. Whether you need to put color on the tips of missiles, on the lenses of Space Marine eyes, or on rivets on your mechs, it really helps to have this tool ready to go and always sharp. In my case, I like to keep both a 3.0 and a 5.0 brush stored somewhere safe where the tip won't get damaged. You never know when you need to make nice, sharp, tiny, crisp details, and these brushes are always just the trick. Digressing a bit, let's return to the proper application of this here Mephiston Red onto these Cretan soldiers. Although this lance is the Otomo, I figure that their infantry support probably would just be in standard House Kurita colors, albeit a little fancy in their samurai-esque armor. To reflect on this, I've decided just to paint their fatigues red and have that stand out as the Kurita detail on these models. Since we're talking 6mm infantry here, there's not a whole lot of detail to speak of. So for that, I'm just going to use my trusty 5.0 brush and carefully apply red all over their bodies. And finally, the last little bit of tiny detail I want to talk about is a free-handed Kurita symbol. Freehand details can elevate your art to a whole nother level with just a tiny bit of effort. Though it can be super intimidating, I'd like to offer up my very next tip: simplify your freehand details. At this scale, your freehand details can be broken down into shapes that kind of evoke the pattern rather than a highly detailed version of it. In this case, the Kurita symbol is reduced to a red circle with a black squiggle that kind of evokes the dragon. It's more than sufficient at this scale, and these mechs can instantly be identified as aligned with the Draconis Combine. Next up in this here painting process, we're going to use some of that ubiquitous liquid talent in a bottle, Citadel's Nuln Oil. This stuff has just the right color of greasy brown black to give a bit of grimy shade that's just right. For that matter, it's time to share my next tip for swift work: wash your metallics. These true metallic colors give a bit of shine on models and do a great job of catching the light, but they often appear a bit flat. Whether you intend on highlighting up these portions of your models or not, it's undeniable that true metallic colors look absolutely spiffy with a bit of this here liquid shade. I highly recommend Nuln Oil for your silver tones and Agrax Earthshade for any golden bits. With the majority of the painting done on these here models, it's time to jump to the next technique to apply some fantastic quick and dirty details to this simple paint job. By using a bit of this here Winsor & Newton Artist Oil Color Lamp Black and a small amount of Artist White Spirit, we're going to make up the secret weapon in my next tip: oil wash for the win. Oil washes are one of the absolute best ways to quickly add some extra grime and shading to your paint jobs. They also work really well to hide your crimes, if you will. A nice gungy oil wash can serve to unify uneven color blends as well as hide little mistakes in your brushwork. Ever since learning about this technique, I can't imagine painting up battle mechs without putting some of this here grime wash over top. Just make sure to let your oil paint dry out a bit on a piece of cardboard before mixing if you're in a hurry. The linseed oil content of these here colors can take an awful long time to evaporate, so I strongly recommend a preemptive dry out before mixing it up. Once you've got your models nice and dirtied up with your chosen color of oil wash, let them sit for about half hour before moving on to this next step. After they've had a bit of time for the solvent to evaporate, go ahead and get back out your white spirit and pour out a small amount of fresh thinner. From here, we want to take a bit of cloth or sponge or a soft brush. I myself am using another makeup brush here. Go ahead and dip your newfound cleaning implement into the unsullied solvent and start wiping away some of the oil stains on your model. In this case, I'm focusing this cleaning on the cockpits and center torsos of these battle mechs, but also trying to clean up the upper surfaces of these stompy boys as well. This is going to help accentuate any efforts to draw the eye to the important focal bits, which is usually the face or the cockpit of a model. In the end, this creates a huge effect for a very little investment of effort. With the grime washing out of the way, I've gone ahead and taken a break to let the solvent completely evaporate from these models. This more or less concludes all of the work on the main bodies of these figures, and from here remains just a few steps to beautify these mechs. The last real bit of effort in these paint jobs is going to be lens jeweling. This is a real fun technique that adds an easy bit of high detail to any paint job. On mechs, this can be applied to cockpit canopies and laser weapons alike. For these black and gold warriors, I've opted to make the cockpit canopies green. I like to start with a deep green for the base coat, and for that, I've chosen this Apple Barrel Hunter Green. I started painting figures with this paint line, and I always look for excuses to use it in my work. This color is going to cover all of the area that'll be green, and from here we can start building up the jeweled lens look. It doesn't even need to be a super solid coat, but just enough to know that the green base layer is there. Once that base coat is down and dried, we're going to continue making these panels look like shiny, reflective surfaces. The next color for these particular jeweling efforts is going to be Citadel's Warboss Green. I'm just going to take a bit of this paint and apply it to my wet palette at full strength without blending it in with the previous color. From here, my intention is to apply this color to the canopies using a method called wet blending. I'll apply the Warboss Green into the bottom right corner of each panel, full strength, and similarly apply the Hunter Green into the upper left corner of the same panel. Once these colors are in place, I can take a clean brush and work the boundaries of the color together until a smooth blend is present. There's no real recipe or proportions to follow here. Just work the two colors together until you've got a smooth and satisfying blend. The only real guideline I can suggest is to ensure that there's a bit of the Warboss Green at full strength in the lower right corner. It's real important to have that little bit of full strength in the corner because we're going to go on to the next color with Citadel's Moot Green. I'm going to take this color and get some out just like last time and not mix it up, and I'm going to apply just the tiniest little bit of this in the lower right corner of each of these panels. From here, I'm going to take a little bit of water on my brush and then blend out the edges of this color until it fades into nothingness. And what I'll be left with is a tiny bit of a blend and one little line of solid moot green in the lower right corner. This will go a long way towards lending a sense of dimensionality to the piece and help to really sell the illusion that this panel is made of some kind of reflective surface. Though this third layer isn't strictly necessary when trying to get your models done in a hurry, it's an easy to execute step that adds a lot of subtle detail to your speed painted figures. Plus, the painted area is so tiny that you'll have it done in a flash. Now, on to the final color in these jeweled canopies. We're going to use Citadel's White Scar to add a specular highlight into the upper left corner of each of these panels. This color is notoriously really bad for blending and applying in large quantities, but for this particular application, I find that it works just fine and dandy. Once again, it's time to bring out the tiniest, sharpest detail brush in your arsenal and use just the very tip to apply small dots of solid white into the corner opposite the previous highlight. This is a fantastic opportunity to get creative with the shape of your light source, so in my case, I've opted to represent these mechs as standing under the sky in a binary system, hence the 2 dots rather than 1. And with that, the lens jeweling is complete, or rather, it would be if it weren't for my next tip. Mod Podge Gloss makes things shiny. I absolutely love this stuff. And this little container here is another one of those convenient and inexpensive products that's sometimes sold at your local dollar store. Just apply a heavy coat of this pasty white liquid over any area that you really want to shine, and it'll cure up in a crystal clear high gloss finish in no time. 10 out of 10, I highly recommend. And we're going to use it today to put the finishing touch on these here jeweled canopies. Now that the lens jeweling is finished, the paint job on these models is complete. That leaves just one final step, which also happens to be my next tip: black the rims. A model isn't really finished until the base rim is detailed, and the most convenient and easily recognized color to do so is black. In this case, I'm using Golden Fluid Acrylics Carbon Black since it has a semi-gloss finish that's extremely durable. Of course, black isn't the only color to finish good-looking bases with, but the advice remains: paint your base rims and your game pieces look complete. At last, it's time to introduce today's guest palette, Beedrill. As is now tradition around here, we've got a small reservoir of super glue applied to today's guest palette, which will facilitate application in very small amounts. Since these models are 6mm scale, adding little bits of base decoration requires only the smallest dabs of glue. These particular models are in a dry and dusty environment, almost completely devoid of any kind of vegetation, but there is a tiny bit of greenery. This little bit of embellishment on the model's bases really helps to sell the environment, but there's one thing to remember. Of course, that thing also happens to be my next tip. Keep your basing in scale. These models represent huge machines stomping through a tiny world, and the bits of flocking need to reflect that. If I were to include the same clumps that I'd use on 28mm scale models, these tiny undergrowth shrubs would look like enormous bushes. Instead, the bits used here need to remain micro-sized and reserved. And just like that, in a single day's worth of work, I got this here lance with combined arms ready and painted up, ready to throw down on the tabletop. By no means are they going to win any kind of awards, and in fact look a little sloppy in certain spots. But honestly, when you view these mechs at an arm's length distance, they look just fine. And I hope that you found this really entertaining and you picked up on some tips to go ahead and get your mechs done in a quick and timely fashion. As always, I want to thank y'all for stopping by. We've got some new content going to be coming out in the next few months. I'm not sure how often I'll be posting stuff, but I'm going to stick to it and get some more stuff done for y'all to watch and enjoy in your own time. These projects are never easy, and in fact take a lot of work to get them done. But they're fun during the process, and they make me happy. And that's exactly what I want y'all to be. So, as always, remember to be happy while you're painting. Take it easy, fellas. See you around next time.